Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Now looking ahead at the finals matchup that we officially have, the Dallas Mavericks and the Boston Celtics. And I want to sort of just run through some of the key things that I'm looking at ahead of this series. Now, before we dive into anything, I think that it is just important to reiterate that any stats you may have from when these two teams played during the regular season, throw them away. Because in the NBA in 2024, this is something that you should probably be doing anyways in terms of not buying into the regular season results. Just ask the Phoenix Suns in terms of how their regular season success against the Timberwolves played out for them in the playoffs. But even with this series especially so, Mavericks and Celtics played twice during the regular season, and the Mavericks are just an entirely different team than they were at that point, where the first game was January 22nd, and the second game was on March 1st. Game 1 was before the trade deadline, so it was a completely different version of the Mavericks, and then Game 2 was the 8th game of PJ and Gafford in Dallas. So still took a lot of time for them to sort of fully assimilate into the offense and get them to the point where they currently are now. And, you know, you look at the nuance of this defense and the way that Gafford and Washington have been able to sort of amp this thing up. Plus the offensive reliability as well, where they moved on from Grant Williams, who was just clearly never a good fit in Dallas. So, you know, I think that that's just something to remember. I know that people are going to be looking into anything they can in terms of predictors, but I would not take those regular season matchups as to how to make your decision for this series. But my first biggest question is, do the Celtics have any shot of limiting Luka Doncic? And there is no such thing in my eyes as fully shutting down Luka. And I think that, you know, ultimately, if you look at that closeout game against the Mavericks, or against the Timberwolves, you have to do a better job of at least making things difficult. Luka is always going to hit the tough shots, but Minnesota was just letting him get anything he wanted, especially in that first quarter, and you are going to put yourselves in that type of a hole and sort of feel hopeless for the rest of the game like Minnesota did. So I think that it's interesting. Again, you know, there's no such thing as fully shutting him down, but what types of things can they do to slow him down some? I would imagine they're going to put maybe a little bit more size with Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. They had two All-NBA second-team guards in Drew Holiday and Derek White. I'm sure they will be very heavily involved against Kyrie, but for Luka, he is sort of this unsolvable puzzle to some degree, and I don't know if there is a perfect defender to guard him, but having a little bit more of that size and length and muscle especially is important to guarding him. So, you know, how much will their All-NBA guards be involved in it? I think that the Celtics are going to be very switch heavy in this series. I mean, they've been switch heavy from a defensive perspective basically all season long. So I would anticipate that they will continue with that. Now I'm curious on the other end to see how Luka wants to attack that, because, you know, I'm sure that to some degree he's going to be looking to try and work the pick and roll game, which, when you look at what happened against Minnesota, it was Rudy Gobert more times than not playing that drop coverage. Now, sometimes they blitzed them, but either way, it did open up sort of stuff on the back end as well, because when Rudy would drop, he would still at least, he'd be in no man's land, which was just a puzzle that Minnesota really couldn't figure out, but he was still giving up the lobs while not doing a great job of coming up to contest Luka either. So you have to shut down something in that perspective. And Luka, it's easier said than done with him. But ultimately, you know, I think that Celtics are going to try and switch everything. They have players, and especially their guards, that they feel like can hold up against some of the bigger offensive players. And as much as Gafford and Lively are massive impact energy guys, I feel pretty good about Drew Holiday holding his in a post-up against either one of them. That was a deliberate thing that the Celtics tried to do, especially early on in the year, where he would be the primary defender against Karl Anthony Towns in a game against Minnesota. He guarded Bam, he guarded Giannis, he guarded Embiid. It's something that we know that he can do. So, again, switch everything is what I'm expecting from the Celtics. But I mentioned the pick and roll situation. I think that Luka is probably going to want to hunt Al Horford, which is something that we saw both Indiana and Cleveland do over the course of the past two series, which is why Kristaps Porzingis' return is going to be so impactful. I'm curious if there's going to be any level of animosity. I don't think that Porzingis and Luka disliked each other, but I feel like I could see Luka wanting to have a little bit of an edge mentally in that matchup. So, I don't know, just something to sort of throw out there. But that sort of leads me into the next point here of how is Mazzulla going to choose to incorporate Porzingis back into the game plan? He hasn't played since early on in the first round against the Miami Heat, dealing with that calf strain. And it's a little bit of a question of, I think that he's going to be good to go in game one, but let's say that he is. How much is he going to play? Is he going to start? Or are they going to look to have Al, I would imagine, probably in the starting lineup as long as he can play, and have Al come off the bench, get Porzingis' feet a little bit wet, and probably to that pick and roll point, not want Luka to get red hot and start feeling himself in game one of this series by picking on Al. But, we'll see how that necessarily works. I think that the idea of the Celtics and what defense are they going to play against Luka is going to be the biggest conversation, because as we're going to talk about with the other storylines headed into this finals series, Luka is at a point, especially with going nuclear in that Game 5 matchup, that he is feeling himself at an all-time level, and, maybe that could lead to a little bit of a letdown spot in game one, but ultimately he is the heart of that offense, and I'm curious to see whether or not the Celtics can, again, at least make things more difficult for him. And I think that's what's going to be sort of what dictates this series. If Luka picks them apart defensively, I do think it's going to be, pretty hard for the Celtics to consistently stick in this with their offense, because the Celtics are the best offense that the Mavericks are going to play in this postseason run. A Clippers team, especially without Kawhi Leonard, a young Oklahoma City team where we saw, outside of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, there wasn't a ton of creation. We saw Jalen Williams sort of struggle with his, I wouldn't say motor necessarily, but just he wasn't necessarily playoff ready just yet. And that was a very young Oklahoma City team. And then, again, a pretty one-dimensional, frankly, Minnesota team. And all of those teams are good, and you can definitely make an argument that the worst one of those teams is better than the best team the Celtics have played in their postseason run. But, regardless, I think the Celtics are the best offense out of any of those three teams the Mavericks have faced so far. So it's going to be a new test for their defense. Both of these, two top-tier defenses, they've both been incredible down the stretch of the season. There's also a stat that I have here as well in regards to the fact that the best records in the NBA since February 5th have been the Boston Celtics and the Dallas Mavericks. So feels like, you take this second half of the season sample size, these are the two best teams, and feels like it's going to be an incredible series. For the Celtics, what I'll very briefly say on them is the Mavericks are going to force you to make shots, and specifically from the outside, which, given the Celtics' history of being maybe a little bit too excited to shoot a lot of three-pointers, that sounds like something that could play into their favor, But same can be said for Oklahoma City. And again, the Celtics mentally at this point, I think, are miles ahead of where the Thunder were headed into that series from a maturity standpoint. But you can see how if you get that series felt like, whoever was going to hit more threes won. I'm not going to say that that's the exact same case in this series, but if the Celtics are outshot from the three-point line by the Mavericks, I do find it really hard to believe with the way that the Mavericks take away the paint that this could be incredibly tough for them, which yet again is an example of why Porzingis and his interior presence does make a big difference in this series. But I'm not going to make an official prediction just yet, although I am definitely leaning with the Celtics in this series. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. We're going to be taking our final break here, and then we are going to dive into some of the media storylines that we are going to hear over the next week or so. So stick with us, and we will be right back.